and welcome to another episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die. It is just me, Nate, and since normally Francis does the introduction on every single episode, it's pretty clear up front that it's not Francis on this, it's just me. However, I am joined by two very special guests, people who I've been wanting to speak to on the show for a while, AJ and Brian from the Worst of All Possible Worlds podcast. Hello, gentlemen, how are you doing?
Hi, good. How you doing, Nate?
Dumping rain and windy in Britain, so it's when we had the Google call open, you had the Zoom background, I think, and it was like, I don't know if that was a fake background with like dumping rain against the windows, but that's literally what it looks like outside my window right now, except it's dark.
Oh yeah, that's that was a Google Chrome extension background, which is very, very lovely. I didn't know they had all those options.
Yeah, me neither.
You could have a little coffee steaming in the background.
Yeah,
it
looks nice. It looks very, very pleasant.
Nate, before we begin, I would like to say I'm deeply sorry about your very alive queen right now contracting COVID as of this morning.
Yeah, the deference towards the royal family is something that is very difficult to understand as someone who has, enough of a British family background to have gotten a British passport, basically being eligible for citizenship from birth. But
sure, so this must be hitting you really hard.
That's the thing. I just never got it. And living here, It's weird because I don't think most people care. It's just that the sort of like shamed into following the group is such a big thing here. And the voices of people who do care about that are really, really loud. So it's weird. I think if the Queen dies or when they confirm the Queen is already dead, it's going to touch off some of the weirdest, most like completely topsy-turvy land Anglo derangement. And I'm partially excited and also partially worried that someone I care about is going to say something really funny online and then get doorstepped by every tabloid in this country.
Oh, God. Oh, no.
They're weird, man. The media here is awful. I mean, this is total derailing, but I don't know if you were... All right. I'm not someone you would expect to be a fan of the Serial podcast because my unit was the subject of Serial Season 2. And while I don't think they got that much stuff factually wrong, I think a lot of the context just seemed to kind of like draw what I might describe as pat conclusions where I don't think those conclusions existed, or like comparisons, parallels, etc. I found it, for lack of a better word, I kind of found it to be annoying. However, Serial did a series about a scandal in Britain, in British schools in 2014, basically where the entire government created this like call the cops on everyone Muslim you know program in response to a supposed threat letter or letter saying that like Islamists were taking over this particular school in Birmingham. And the government knew it was fake, but they did it anyway. And it's led to all sorts of crises, to include people, who were involved in these schools that had turned around failing schools, being banned from working in education for life. So really, really grim thing. And the way they investigated it was by just asking people, because no one in British media would do that. And it's just very funny because British media is furious that the New York Times dares cover anything about Britain because of their anti-British slant or something. And they're all kind of circling the wagons. And I'm not joking. They've decided that it's a misogynist podcast because one of the co-hosts, who's a British Muslim young guy, who this was his first like story, used the metaphor. He basically mixed up the metaphor of, squeezing blood from a stone and pulling teeth to describe a difficult conversation with a female member of Birmingham City Council who wasn't very forthcoming. And they're like, oh, he wants to draw blood from women. He's a misogynist. And now they're all,
my
100% they're doing that.
Whoa.
Because they're dumber than shit, and the only way you work in media is to understand your goal in life is to get invited to the big garden party with all the racists from The Spectator every year. It's not to be a fucking reporter. So anyway, that's Britain chat.
I've noticed that this is a big tactic for like the reactionary side of the British world, is to claim misogyny wherever they go, right? Like that's the big part of the transphobia thing. And
I think one thing is that feminism is kind of right wing here. Or rather, there is right-wing feminism here, whereas in America, like, American reactionaries are so opposed to the word feminism, much less the concept of it, that, like, if you're a right-winger, like, the sort of, am I using this correctly? The shibboleth is that you have to basically be like, I'm not feminist. I hate feminism. That's not the case here.
I do notice in a lot of more conservative circles that a lot of conservative women will say, I'm not a feminist. I uphold the values of like traditional marriage and stuff.
I
and
basically
really
got a lecture from a friend of mine who was a raised evangelical woman from Alaska who was a lieutenant in the army when I was a captain, basically saying that like unemployment in America is because of feminism and women having jobs. And I'm like, do you not see the fucking irony here?
Jesus.
Well, that was like the big, because I went to a Christian school, I went to a Christian college, and that was always the big like note that someone might be a liberal is like, well, they're pretty feminist.
Oh man,
like
so at this point,
Fascinating.
in lieu of, normally Francis and I go on about the weather and our gardens, and we call the first 10 minutes of the podcast Dad Chat, and we're basically doing that in our own way. And so I wanted to give you a chance to explain the concept of the worst of all possible worlds. I've guessed it on the show and really enjoyed it, but it introduced me to what you might describe as an entire fictive universe I didn't know existed and wish I could forget about.
Yeah.
A big part of our focus is
on the family.
Yes, specifically focus on the family. This evangelical organization that was founded in Southern California, moved to Colorado Springs, Colorado, and started making family entertainment, cartoons and radio dramas specifically, in order to influence culture and to do so specifically for the Christian right wing. And so we specifically go through this radio series called Adventures in Odyssey as one of our sort of main series, tracking this radio drama that's been around from 1987 and is still running today. They're currently putting out new episodes as we speak.
Yeah, the best way we like to pitch it is that it's like the evangelical Simpsons. It focuses on one specific town, and the main character has the actor playing him has died twice, and they're now on their third John Avery Whitaker. And Brian and Josh thought it would be funny because they grew up with Adventures in Odyssey to inflict this upon me.
to subject it to people who did not grow up in our particular faith background.
And we're joined by
Right.
Josh, who was late getting on the call, and so you're going to hear a third guest as well. Josh, you can hear us correctly?
Yeah,
Correct?
I can hear you. I'm here. Hello.
Welcome, Josh.
Hey, Josh.
Hi.
All right, sweet. So I knew nothing about this stuff, and the closest I came to evangelical Christianity as a kid, as a late childhood, early adolescence, was I lived in New Mexico because my dad worked he was an active duty Army officer, but he was working for the New Mexico National Guard for a couple of years. And so there's not really a ton of big Army bases out there in near Santa Fe.
Well, if he had done it a couple decades later, he could have ended up being a school teacher for a few weeks.
Yeah, agreed. Well, so we lived in New Mexico, and as you might guess, there's a ton of Mormons out there because it's very close to Utah, especially in northern New Mexico. And so my dad had been a Boy Scout and was really into Boy Scouting. And what he didn't realize was that Boy Scouts is like the Mormons' official youth group. So if you do Boy Scouts, that's like their youth group for their church, the Boy Scouts of America. So if you do Boy Scouts in New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and certainly Utah, you're probably going to be in a Mormon Boy Scout troop, and it's going to be through a Mormon church.
Well, and that's also
fascinating.
why they, and then maybe this is where you're going with this, but that's why they were so just ardent about not letting gay scoutmasters and gay kids into the scouts.
100%. And I talked about this, I think, when I appeared on The Worst of All Possible Worlds, but one of the things that I learned, I had a family of Mormons near us. They had 7 kids, and 5 of them were good friends of mine. They're really nice people. We're still friends to this day, but they did the full Mormon thing. They woke up every morning and read scripture. They had gardens where they grew stuff. They had the special fridge and freezer for apocalypse food. All their kids were homeschooled, and a lot of the stuff they consumed was sort of in the same way that a lot of Mormons back then, and maybe still do stuff with Amway and buy Amway stuff, both because it's cheap and also because it's sort of tied into the community, sort of a multi-level marketing scheme as a job for spouses.
Well, and Josh is from the home of Amway.
Sure am.
Oh, no kidding.
And my high school's gym was funded entirely by Rich DeVos, the founder.
Oh, wow.
Amway, co-founder. Yeah.
I've got a question I've got to ask you in a second, but the point I was going to make, though, is that much like sort of entertainment products that relate to mainstream entertainment the same way Amway relates to regular brands, I encountered a lot of what you might describe as Mormon entertainment, movies, radio plays, etc. There's this movie called Saturday's Warriors that's about kids, I think, training to be missionaries, but it's a musical, and I remember hearing the soundtrack and hearing the songs and a lot of the stage bits when we were driving to and from places related to Boy Scouts in their big van. And so when you guys played this stuff, that was the thing that I I compared it to the most that I could relate to with Adventures in Odyssey is that it reminded me of Mormon stuff. But in a way, the Mormon stuff wasn't really so much about the libs are bad and they're trying to, destroy Christianity. So much it was sort of about like adhering to Mormonism and like the specialness of Mormonism and like preaching the gospel and going on your mission and like, telling people the truth about Jesus Christ visiting the fucking Americas in prehistory and stuff like that. And that
I think a big part of modern Mormonism is like assimilation, right? They don't want to be separate from most mainstream evangelical Christianity. They want to be seen as kind of the same thing, and they want to be very friendly and they want to be very inviting, as opposed to evangelicals want to be that too, but they just get too hopped up about things.
Yeah. I think the question I was going to ask you then really kind of relates to that, which is I only encountered evangelical Christianity as an adult when I was in the military, because once I, got out of the military, well, I didn't grow up with it at all. I grew up with, like I told you guys before, with both my dad was Episcopalian and my mom's Jewish. And I grew up with very little practice, like organized religion in general. And then when I got out of the military, I lived in New York, and like there's not a ton of overt evangelical stuff. And when I was in the Army, though, both people that I was in the Army with and also the places I lived, specifically Georgia and North Carolina, there's a ton of evangelical Christianity. Also, weirdly, South Korea, there's a huge amount of evangelical Baptism out there.
Oh, yes.
More so than I think people are expecting when they think about Korea. But so the point I make is that like I didn't really understand that this was a huge kind of like route for evangelicals, that people were like, you should join the military. It is a thing you should do. Like it is, serving God to be in the military. I guess I could have sussed that out, but in the military, you do experience that. And the thing I'll leave you guys with to let you respond is, in my experience, the higher in rank you go, the more pronounced it is. The more often you'll literally be asked by people like, are you going to church and stuff like that? Like what your religion is. I got told, because I decided out of a desire to just end the question altogether of what religious practice I should put on my officer record brief. I first had Episcopalian because my dad's family is Episcopalian, and finally just put atheist. And I was like, fuck it, I'm just going to leave it. Like, I don't care. And I got told, listen, you can do that if you want to, and it's fine. You're allowed to. You can put Wiccan on there if you want to. But the further you go, the more a problem it's going to be that your ORB says atheist, because of how many evangelicals are in officer leadership positions in the military. If you don't want any religion on that, you need to put no religious preference, because atheist is going to make them mad. And that was interesting. I was like, oh, wow. Yeah, okay. Fucking okay. So I want to ask you guys, like growing up, how was the military sort of pitched to you, and how were you taught to understand it?
So my grandparents, both my grandpas fought in World War II, that sort of thing. My dad was military too. He was in the public health service, which is a branch of the military most people don't know exists. Yeah. Like the times when I was renewing my dependence ID until I was 26 to, stay on my dad's insurance, I would go to this armory in Grand Rapids where they could do it. But every time the guy asked me, what branch is this?
Yeah, it's why the Surgeon General wears military rank in a uniform.
Yeah. And so, I grew up with some degree of it. Like my uncle fought in Vietnam. I had a couple of cousins who enlisted, and my area, because it's a poor area growing up, has a high rate of military enlistment. Yeah. And to the point where Gallup, New Mexico was once labeled the most patriotic small town in America. And they tore down all of their great billboards for like, you're arriving in Gallup, old Route 66, or like pictures of the mountains. And they just put up these little chintzy American flags, most patriotic.
Hell yeah, dude. Hell yeah.
To be fair, that was a Gallup poll, so it was a little biased.
There we go. And also,
you can't Gallup, get me. I'm not there.
Gallup is also where the Navajo Code Talkers were. They trained at Fort Wingate just outside of town. Mm-hmm. And so a big part of that pitch was not only, of course, going to a Southern Baptist church and having a Texan pastor who was always talking about the military, and both of his sons went to West Point. And it was also just like built into the fabric of this community, regardless of religious background. But definitely like after 9/11, it was just like flags everywhere, sermons about America. We got to go to war. No questions about it. Support President Bush. He's pro-life. So we're going to do everything that he wants to do because he hates abortion and gay marriage.
Oh, man, you just jogged my memory. I babysat when I was probably 12 or 13 for a family down the end of the street who were evangelical. And I remember seeing Concerned Mothers for America flyers and stuff in their house that were all basically that. And then you jogged my memory because I remember after 9/11, they put up a sign that had like a cartoon, sort of like respectful cartoon of Bush and a respectful cartoon of a Chinook helicopter and troops. And it said, support our troops, support our president.
I remember going to the post office, and they just had this comic on the wall that just the caption said Osama bend over, and it was bin Laden with a fucking missile in his asshole.
Fuck.
Oh boy.
Man.
Like something my parents would not let me see in any other context, but since it was at the barbershop we always went to, I guess it was fine.
Yeah, I mean, I guess at a certain point they're like, well, I mean, as long as it hates Osama bin Laden, we can allow a couple of swears.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm trying to think of people that I knew when I was a lieutenant in my first unit. I would say of the guys I was, almost all of the officers were white. I think with like the only exceptions being like a couple of East Asian guys, one and one Hispanic guy, like Central American guy who had been enlisted before and then become an officer. And what I recall is that two of these guys were very, very evangelical. One was like just like Southern Baptist evangelical, and the other one was from sort of like what I would now realize is sort of vaccine denial level of like kind of more fringe in that regard. I don't know, maybe that's not fringe anymore. But that was among lieutenants. Most of the guys were just like probably not quite college Republican conservative, but not particularly political white dudes who'd gotten ROTC scholarships and gone to school. They hadn't gone to military academies. But then in like amongst senior people we would encounter, company commanders, it was a little more common. Battalion commanders, it was way more common. Meeting brigade commanders or division commanders, like they'd often start out by like their faith being the most important thing in their military career and stuff like that. Like it did seem like it was there, and it was just pronounced as you went up higher in rank. And I don't know if you guys felt like there was a pressure to do that, or if it's because of that sort of overlap between the fact that like evangelical Christianity is pretty popular in my experience in white working class parts of America, and like the military is also like an attractive thing if you want a job with benefits without ideology. Right. But if you couple ideology with that, then it gets even more intense.
Well, I remember, I am not of the infamous white working class, so I can't speak to that. But having grown up in the white, I guess, middle class, and very much the Christian part of that. So I went to a Christian school. I actually went to a Christian elementary school, a Christian middle school, and a Christian high school. So very much like in the dogma from the beginning to the end. And I remember that to the point of Amway, the schools that I went to were funded by DeVos money. And a lot of the outlook that I was sort of taught at those schools was very much that sort of like prosperity gospel / dominionist theology, right? The idea that everything ought to be basically made subject to the Lord, in that the way that that's done is by us going out there as his representatives and sort of fucking shit up on his behalf. In terms of then how that translated over to the military and stuff, we did have recruiters come by pretty regularly. And I don't think that really very many people actually ended up joining. But I do remember that with quite a bit of regularity, we would have recruiters come in, do like the pull-up competitions and shit like that. There were a couple kids, I think, who did end up joining. And then also at the college that I went to, which is where I met Brian, there was also an ROTC program there. And those ROTC kids, were very much on that track of like the next leaders and shapers of the United States military who love the Lord deeply. The other thing that I remember is that there was always this feeling that the military was sort of like God's way of showing how much he loved us, in that like the troops were
because of all the freedoms and everything that
right.
they guarantee.
Wow,
Yeah.
okay.
Like I have this distinct memory of going to a church one Sunday, and this is not my church, the church I grew up in. This is a different church. But it was, I want to say like Veterans Day weekend or something like that, or Memorial Day, you know, one of those weekends. And that there was this whole like 15-minute thing where rather than singing hymns, we just sang patriotic songs. You know, we sang national anthem. We sang the battle hymn of the Republic.
Were they in your hymnal, Josh?
They were not in the hymnal, no,
Okay.
but they, you know, they put it up on the screen.
With the Southern Baptists, it's in the hymnal.
Oh, hell yeah, dude.
Oh, wow.
Oof.
The Southern Baptist hymnal famously has 666 songs in it. I don't really know how they settled on that. But like 12 of them are like patriotic songs. And we always had a 4th of July service.
Wow.
That like talked to, you know, like had the whole like old people choir would sing these medleys with the pre-recorded music, and they'd play videos of little kids where they'd ask them who they thought wrote the Pledge of Allegiance, and the kids would all say Jesus, and everyone would giggle and
we used to get letters from Christian schools from kids when we were deployed, and it was just like, thanks, but what the fuck am I supposed to do with this?
Yeah.
And like if you're gonna send me letters from kids, could you also send me like toothpaste and soap and deodorant and candy?
What sorts of things did those letters say, Nate? What were they thanking you for?
I mean, just it was your garden variety stuff about like thank you, Jesus loves you, etc., things like that. But there was one in particular that I thought was very, very funny, and so did my soldiers at our outpost, because a little kid had drawn what I would describe as a sort of crude representation of Jesus, who looked as though he had a very kind of knowing smirk on his face. This kid was probably about 7 or 8 at most, and a speech bubble coming out of his mouth that said, "I love you," and then the text above it wrote, "Jesus is watching you." But like I said, the knowing smirk on his face made it seem as though he's like, "I love you, but I know what you're fucking doing." And so my soldiers, being sacrilegious geniuses, decided to tape it up inside the door of the sit-down toilet that we had in our fucking thing. So like, oh, you go in there, you think you're going to jack off? Well, guess what? Jesus loves you, and he's watching you right now.
And he's kind of into it.
Yeah, exactly. I have to. It's hard to explain this to people living in Europe now, because, like I said, I didn't grow up, observant. But it was around me all the time in school, because you have things like the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And then in the military, a lot of times when you're in training, certainly when I was like, for example, in Ranger School, like if you went to some of the chaplain services, like you would get a little bit of extra food, and like you're being deprived of food as part of the course. So, it's not a surprise that people with, call it some kind of Protestant background, tend to come out of stuff like that a lot more religiously observant. Like the only thing you're allowed to carry with you, like the reading material we were allowed to have in Ranger School was our Ranger handbook and this like book of Ranger prayers. And it was just like, it was like a book of common prayer kind of thing, but it was very, it was extremely not Catholic. It was extremely Protestant. And I remember one of my friends, still a good friend to this day, grew up observant Catholic in like the Chicago suburbs. And one night, the only religious service where you got free food or whatever was like a Protestant one. And they were like singing a bunch of songs. And he was just like, what the fuck is this shit? It's like, is this what Protestants do? Like, what the fuck? Is this like a barbecue? Like, what is wrong with these people? And it was really funny to me, because I had a lot of Catholic friends growing up as well, but I had never seen a Catholic, like an observant Catholic, react to how weird evangelical Protestant stuff can get.
Yeah.
That is the entire basis of our podcast for the most part, is me staring in slack-jawed horror at the gaping maw that is evangelical Christianity.
Yeah, and so there were encounters like that with this stuff, in which you'd find yourself just sort of like, oh, okay, well, I'm gonna be the asshole if I push back against this, but as a result of that, you're just sort of like drowning in it constantly. And I wouldn't even say like it's done officially, but I mean, I've known people who, for example, were not religious, who were filed equal opportunity complaints in the army and had them substantiated against, for example, their chain of command for them trying to like be super religious. But like, I know for a fact that if you do that, if you're in like a combat arms thing, like that's gonna, like if you're an infantryman, if you're in a combat arms branch of the army, it's gonna harm you. Like it's gonna damage your reputation.
One thought that I had about that all is that, in many cases, I think, and this is absolutely not like any sort of an excuse, but in many cases, the people who are most indoctrinated in this sort of thing, the reason that they see everything through this lens and through this framework is that they literally do not understand what a world outside of that framing looks like, because it's just part of who they are. And they've been told their entire lives that this is the right thing. So like, for instance, let's say that you're like, let's say that you're proselytizing to, people who are below you in the chain of command. Obviously, that is an extreme ethical violation on a number of different levels. But from their perspective, they might be saving their life, like that. And it's
they're saving their immortal soul. Yeah.
I remember my battalion commander asked our chaplain, who was a evangelical Protestant, if he was interested in any kind of thing about like interfaith stuff, speaking to some of like the imams on the government's compound in Afghanistan. And he was just sort of like, yeah, if something comes up, absolutely, sir, just let me know. But like he basically told me, I was talking to him one time, he's like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. He's like, it's a heathen religion. Why the fuck would I want to talk to these guys? And I'm just like, you probably have at least one or two Muslim soldiers. You got a fuckload of Muslim Afghan soldiers who work directly with us. Like, come on, man.
Well, and like the commander in chief, like when we went to Afghanistan and Iraq, was not only a Christian, but he was an apocalyptic Christian, right? He really thought that what he was doing was part of the end times. I mean, stuff from private meetings where they'd talk about Gog and Magog, and like it is so built into all of this that it's like, oh yeah, the military isn't on paper, it's like it's not necessarily going to be that, but like, who's going to stop it from being this like kind of Christian crusade force where the people at the top, or and like even contracting with people like Eric Prince and everything like that. And Eric Prince is has this psychotic desire to rid the world of every Muslim.
If I'm not mistaken, two of the three of you are from Michigan, right? Or is it just you, Josh?
It's just me, but Brian went.
Yeah, I went to college in Michigan.
Gotcha. Okay, because I mean, you mentioned Gallup, so I figured
my school. Yeah, my school growing up was a mission founded by Dutch missionaries from West Michigan.
Gotcha.
And still has a lot of that's sort of how I ended up in Michigan. It's like all of our student teachers would come from up there, and all of our actual teachers, most of them went to school at Calvin or Hope.
Brian, you grew up
Dort.
You grew up Southern Baptist, but you're culturally Dutch Protestant.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, like because 5 days out of the week I was at a Dutch Protestant school, and then on Sunday and Wednesday nights I'd be at the Southern Baptist church.
Because I guess I bring this up because of the DeVos connection and Eric Prince connection. Mm-hmm. If I'm not mistaken, Betsy DeVos and Eric Prince are related. Like, aren't they brother and sister or brother-in-law? Yeah.
Yeah, they're the daughters of the Prince auto part manufacturers.
They invented the thing that is it the thing? It's the thing that holds
the mirror thing
in your mirror.
Yeah, so when you pull down your sun visor on the windshield and you pull up the door and the light comes on,
that's what that is.
They have a patent on that. They have the thing that turns your light on as you open the little door.
Got it. Wow. Because
which made them billionaires.
Fans of the show who don't know this, Eric Prince was at one point a Navy SEAL and is the founder of Blackwater. And Betsy DeVos was the Secretary of Education, and their sort of tentacles, if you will, are everywhere in Michigan. I was telling a story to my co-host on Trash Future a couple of days ago about a guy I knew from Michigan who got sent to basically like a DeVos-funded Christian like correctional school because of he was dating a girl, and they went to the park to like make out, and the cops came and they ran and got chased by a dog, and the dog attacked the girl, and so he hit the dog to try to get it off her, and so he was charged with like assaulting a police officer.
Oh, what the fuck?
What? Wait, are dogs police officers? Like, are they actually like?
You'll get more time. Like, you'll get more time for killing a police dog than like manslaughter of a person. Like, genuinely. I remember hearing a story about a guy going to prison for like 19 years for shooting a police dog. I talked about this on. We did Britnology, and we're talking about British police shows, and I was just losing my mind at how like how like the cops are combative and they're dickheads, but then it's like, oh yeah, the guy who fought the cops, who forced the cops to pepper spray him and then tried to fight the police dog, he's like the narrator is like, and then he was given a 600-pound or like a 60-pound fine for like criminal mischief. And I was just thinking to myself, like, in America that's multiple felonies and you'd probably die.
Yeah. I can't wait till they start enforcing that about the robo-dogs, too.
Yeah.
If you kill a robo-dog, then you also get 19 years.
Yeah. I mean, long story short, it was kind of, this is kind of a discursive conversation, but I was bringing it back to the DeVos thing that Eric Prince seems to me to be a pretty good representation of a certain side of this kind of evangelical connection. Here is a very, very evangelical Christian who has an ideological mission, and that is to destroy Islam, and also makes a ton of money off private military contracting and made a ton of money off of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And also his guys committed, worse than war crimes and more or less got off because of a shoddy prosecution by the U.S. Department of Defense.
Well, I would love to talk about that for just a little bit because, again, having grown up in it, so much of that can be traced back to, and I sort of mentioned this earlier, but this idea of dominionist theology, the idea that, God can do stuff, but he kind of needs us to do it on his behalf a little bit. Is basically what dominionism comes down to. And if you look at sort of the underpinnings of it and how it carries back, you'll see that there's a lot of overlap as well with the apartheid South Africa. And apartheid South Africa is in many ways one of the best exemplars of dominionism, right? You had these settler colonialists who left their native country, went down to a totally different country, and despite the fact that, they were vastly outpopulated and outpopulated by people who weren't particularly interested in what it is that they were doing, decided that they had the legitimate claim. And that's really when you talk about like Eric Prince or Betsy DeVos, both of the things that they do, they are sort of doing the same project in parallel spheres, right? With Betsy DeVos, it's education. We are basically deconstructing the American system of public education and replacing it with a generally Christian, religious, or at the very least privatized and market-based system of education, because again, that's what God wants. And then same project on the military side of things with Eric Prince. It's dismantling any form of accountability whatsoever, replacing it with a series of private mercenaries who will do whatever is necessary to extinguish basically the menace, what they perceive as being the menace. They see that as keeping the peace.
Yeah, well, I think so much of that extends out, like the idea of dominion too, and Christian dominion. It comes from us settling the United States. It comes from the constant westward expansion, manifest destiny, city on a hill. We are agents of God and Christ, moving into this land, bringing the light of heaven with us and driving out the darkness of Native Americans. And that doesn't just go, we got to the coast, our border kind of stopped, and then we, took Guam or whatever, but there's still like, you can't build that up for 150 years and expect the idea of that to fizzle out. So then it starts to become this weird sort of global domination thing, and it starts to manifest itself in these Protestant communities.
Yeah, if we can't go west, where else can we go?
And the Mormons do it too with their missions, but they're a lot more controlled about like their idea of doing mission work, because again, they've shaped what Mormonism looks like over the last century.
I don't know if you guys are familiar with a guy named Matt Shea. He's not from Michigan, but if that story rings any bells, because it ties this together a little bit. So Matt Shea was a former Army officer in the regular Army and then the Washington National Guard, who then became a state rep for a district that's mostly in Spokane, Washington. And he was a Christian dominionist. And in 2018, it got, I guess, leaked or put out that he had authored this memo that he had shared, basically, that he called the biblical basis for war. And he basically said that America needed to be taken over and run on Christian lines, by a holy army. If I remember correctly, it was like no gay marriage, no abortions, no communism. We'll offer peace to people if they yield, but otherwise, if they don't, we'll kill all males. And this is an elected rep for the state. Now, granted, state reps get crazy everywhere, but this is a guy who is, has that exact background, and was a big supporter of the Bundy Ranch shit. I
remember this guy now. Yeah,
all this stuff. He eventually decided to not run again. I think after because the if I remember correctly, either the Washington State House or something with the federal government investigated this. I think it was Washington State though, and they determined that this dude's 100% an extremist. He is a Christian dominionist, more or less white nationalist.
Yeah, and not hiding it at all.
No, not whatsoever. And so when I look at that guy's background, if I look up on his Wikipedia, even if you guys take a look at that, you'll see his face. I could just see him as one of my company commanders. I seriously, man, that's the thing is that, and here's another thing too, I'd point out is that I don't recall the military being really religious, except for the fact that chaplains are there. And so there's going to be chaplain shit. There's going to be prayers said. I've encountered Jewish chaplains. I've encountered Muslim chaplains, Buddhist chaplains, but by and large, it's evangelical Protestants. That's just the thing. And you can opt out of stuff. There's nothing officially religious in the military in the sense of signing stuff on paper. You're not going to be counseled, and disciplined because you aren't religious. But that culture is there, and it's a very, very loud minority, I would say. And a lot of people assume everyone who joins the military is rednecks or something. But the overwhelming majority of soldiers who enlist are from California or Texas, because those are the two most populous states. And most of my soldiers weren't religious. Some of them came from Christian backgrounds and enlisted to get away from it. Some of them came from it and stuck with it, were really religious. You got a big variety, but there's that loud minority. And I feel if anything, Matt Shea and Eric Prince, they're just consistently saying the things that this, for lack of a better word, ideology kind of espouses. And I think if anything, they're just more surprised when people disagree with them, because it sounds to me those communities are very self-reinforcing. And that's, I guess, what I was going to pitch to you guys about do you feel these kinds of things that you're hearing, when you think about Eric Prince and some of the stuff he said, or what I just told you about Matt Shea, would that seem out of place in that world?
When to think about Blackwater, when my cousin came back from Iraq, it was right when the Blackwater scandal spilled over. It was in the news and everything. And my brother asked him, what do you think about these guys? And he said, well, he kind of scratched his chin for a second. I think they get a bad rap, honestly.
Fuck.
Huh. And it's people who aren't necessarily going to say the things that Matt Shea said. I was just looking at the Wikipedia page, and one of his ex-wives said he would insist that she walked on his left side because if he had a sword, it would be on his right.
Oh, fuck, I forgot that detail. That's a thing in the army. That's a thing in the army. The senior ranking person walks on the right, and you have to walk to the left based on rank, as it declines in rank. That's so weird. That's so fucking weird, but yeah.
And so it's my cousin would never say something like that, but he'd also just say, I think people are being unfair to this guy,
Yeah.
he wouldn't, it wouldn't shake him that much to encounter something super fucked up like that, because that's the person that he'll just sort of let it happen. Turn it off. Let the preacher say something absolutely fucking insane, because you're not listening to the sermon anyway about 10 minutes in, and just let it go.
I'm now looking at the photo of Matt Shea on Wikipedia, and he kind of looks like a guy who would run you through with a sword and say, golly gee willikers, while he did it.
I mean, I was just thinking about this with soldiers, because I remember seeing a soldier in the dying facility in Kuwait who had big block letter on his forearms that said, I'm not afraid to say that I believe in Jesus Christ. But then I also had a soldier that had like a spread eagled naked alien tattoo with a little banner that said space pussy. So that's the thing, right? It can be one or the other.
I'm not afraid to say that I love space pussy.
Me too, exactly. Whom among us has not looked towards the stars and thought of the quantities of space pussy just emanating out endlessly?
It's the final frontier, Jerry.
Exactly. How else do you ponder the infinite than that?
So I grew up in San Diego, and which is a very big military town, a very big Navy town. And what I found most interesting is that I went to public school for my first, from K through 8, and then for high school I went to Catholic school. And I actually got a lot more exposure to the military in public school than I ever did in Catholic school. Catholics, for the most part, like we would, bless our troops, and there was an ROTC like root program that you could do. But for the most part, it was mostly kept out of religion in a way that it is so striking listening to all this evangelical media, hearing how it's like in the bones of it. Do you know what I mean? Like your faith is inherently tied to your service to God. Like you have to enact God's will. And I think that comes a lot back to just having to preach his word and how like it's so necessary to convince everyone else to like follow Jesus in a way that Catholics, I think nowadays are a little bit more like, I mean, we have a lot of love here, but if you don't want to come here, you can go other places. It's fine. We know we have a lot of scandals. Yeah. So like, if you want to carry that baggage, we'll throw it at you. But for the most part, most of my exposure to like really ooh-rah-rah military stuff was in public school. And that's because most of my teachers were incredibly conservative. Yeah. And I remember we had to do the closest I ever got to we had to learn all of the fight songs. We did a thing called the USO show in 8th grade, where we brought in all the surviving members of World War II, all the World War II vets that were still alive by the time I was, in 8th grade. And we would perform I played Bob Hope and did an entire Bob Hope routine. But the stage was too shallow for me to swing my golf club, so I clipped a kid while I was trying to go back. And it was also, we did it in this enormous theater. It was like an 800 seat house, and maybe there were 20 people there. It was an incredibly surreal experience. But yeah, I remember being a lot more I remember public school being a lot more pro-military than my actual Catholic school, and you'd think it'd be the opposite.
It's funny for me because I went to a huge high school in central Indiana, but it was sort of the official white flight school district when Indianapolis public schools started doing busing and integration in the 60s and 70s. And so Indianapolis has, because of the low cost of living, because of some of the the high tech industries and medicine and stuff in Indianapolis, you do have wealthy parts of the surrounding area. And I would say Hamilton County, where I'm from, is probably, I think it's the wealthiest county in Indiana, but there's a huge spread. So you could have places that look like any Rust Belt community in America in parts of Hamilton County, and then you also have places that look like, really there are gated suburbs, gated communities, as well as just your garden variety white flight suburb in a Midwest city. And out of my high school, in my graduating class was over 900 kids. I can count easily on two hands, probably on one hand, the number of people who joined the military. It was a very small number. A couple of guys enlisted in the Army or the Navy or the Marines, and a couple of people went to West Point. And then I think I was the only person in my graduating class who did ROTC. I think there were two guys who went to West Point, and there were, that I know of, I recall 2 or 3 guys who enlisted either in the Marines or the Army. I was in a punk band with a kid who enlisted in the Army later on and went to Iraq in 2005, and it completely fucked him up. And I look back on that, I'm just sort of bro, your parents probably moved you to Carmel so you wouldn't go that route. And he was this super cool punk rocker, but he just decided to join the Army, which is, if you've grown up in that environment, a lot of people, the people you wouldn't expect wind up doing it. But I didn't really get, the recruiters came to our school, but I've heard stories about how much more omnipresent they were in, poorer schools, smaller schools, stuff like that.
Absolutely.
And I guess the impression that I got was that, you are kind of reminded of the fact that when you see the presence of evangelicals in the military, that as a percentage of America, it's not a huge community. It's not a gigantic community, but there's it's vocal. And it is probably overrepresented. And I know I have heard friends, one of my good friends told me this from having worked with the Ranger Regiment, the sort of one of the special ops units in the military, that that isn't really like it, or at least in its traditional composition, wasn't super like spec ops, long hair, cool guy shit. It just became that later. That is really, really evangelical by and large. And once again, the further up you go, the more likely you're going to have people who are evangelical and also who are like Rush Limbaugh fan kind of people.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
But that's, once again, I mean, like, that's not, you know, Ranger enlisted soldiers are famous for sort of like how long can I stay in the strip club before I have to get in my car and get to formation level of like really dedicated to a different path, if you want to call it that. And so it's a very weird disconnect.
That was something, because I think a lot of the appeal of the military to like evangelical parents, right, who are raising their kids is like, I don't want to send my child out into this like debauched world, but I can send my kid to a place where they're going to have order and structure, and they don't really have to just sort of fly out into the real world, as it were. So let's put them in the military. And then everyone I knew from my class who enlisted got into, you know, ecstasy and spice and, you know, experimental laboratory drugs and shit like that. And like, and came home in terrible shape. Like really, like it's set them on these, I don't really know anyone who got out and has really held down a stable job or, you know, managed, all of them have had like substance abuse problems. But then there's the image of the military that you get in church, which is very much this like marble pillar. Everything is stable and secure, you know, nice buttoned up little boys with their apple cheeks going and protecting all of our freedoms in Afghanistan, where we accidentally dropped all of our freedoms.
Yeah, I to make that point, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the movie Cherry or the book by Nico Walker. Was kind of a cultural moment there for a while. That he was a guy who was a medic in the army and was from like fucked up Ohio, and you know wound up getting hooked on opiate pills in Iraq, and then got out and became, you know, got addicted to heroin, and then wound up going to prison for robbing banks. And he wrote this memoir. And I there were things with the book I liked. There's things I really didn't like. I felt like in a way it was sort of there was an element of sort of troop exploitation to it, because like the guys who had edited it had sort of like they had kind of fished for this story and gotten him to write it. And I think, you know, there was a significant amount of sort of like let's get the really lurid part of this. But there's a scene in the book, and let's just say that the way the book treats women in general is pretty bad, and also pretty authentic to what I recall seeing my junior soldiers saying and doing. And there's a scene in the book where one of the guys that they hang out and like party with their friend's mom, who's like, she's like 40 and they're like 19 when they're getting ready to go to Iraq. And then their friend dies in Iraq. And when they come back, his mom comes to visit them. And they wind up getting drunk again. And then they just like, these two guys just wind up fucking his mom. And I was like, wow, this is fucked up. This is way more accurate to what my soldiers were like and what they experienced than any sort of like onward Christian soldier shit. Yeah. Like the book more or less ends on the image, if I remember correctly, of them like double teaming this dead guy's mom. And I was just like, this is so fucked up. And like I said, it feels like troop exploitation in a lot of ways. Not that the troops are being exploited, but rather more like the story is sort of got to hit all of like the what you expect troop notes, but be like even more lurid than normal. But that, like, fuck, man, I can't tell you how many guys, you know, would be like, oh yeah, well, weed shows up on a drug test. That's why I do coke or ecstasy or spice. You know, like we had a soldier on our rolls in Korea who like hadn't been in the army, or technically hadn't been in the unit for almost 5 years, but he still had to be accounted for because he was serving a prison term in a Korean prison for trying to import a fuckload of spice through the U.S. postal system, through the APO system. Like, I can't even, like, we need a whole other hour to talk about some of just the most bizarre, fucked up things I've seen troops do. And not just in the sense of like shit that you should be, you know, that's bad for society, but also just like stuff that's not going to be good for your mental health in terms of substance abuse and things like that. And so it is very weird to have it collide with reality. But then also like there's lots of senior people in the military who are like really into that world and kind of pushing that angle, if you will. And that's the thing. It's so funny to hear you say that like for the junior guys who are from that background, like,
Yeah.
if they're not prepared for the actual world, there's lots of stuff that can fuck you up in that world, you know?
Yeah. So I also wanted to bring up something. My dad used to teach Sunday school to the senior citizens of our church. He did that like ever since we moved to New Mexico, like when he was like 30, teaching 80-year-old people. And there was always like a big like Christmas time dinner that they would do. Again, Baptists, all they can do is eat and go to church is the old joke. And at one of these Christmas things, I remember this was like maybe my junior or senior year in high school. One of the old ladies in my dad's class got up and read this poem that she got from like an email forward. It was, that kind of email forward.
Oh yeah, 100%
Marine Todd kind of language. Yeah. And it was called, if I may, I have it in front of me.
Oh, fuck's sake.
It's
yes,
so
please.
good. Brian showed it to me the other day.
It's
and
called
it is,
The Soldier's Night Before Christmas. And it's written from the perspective of Santa Claus.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah. 'Twas the night before Christmas. He lived all alone in a one-bedroom house made of plaster and stone. I had come down the chimney with presents to give, and to see just who in this home did live. I looked all about, a strange sight I did see. No tinsel, no presents, not even a tree. No stocking by the fire, just boots filled with sand. On the wall hung pictures of far distant lands. With medals and badges, awards of all kind, a sober thought came through my mind. For this house was different, so dark and dreary. I knew I had found the home of a soldier, once I could see clearly. I heard stories about them. I had to see more, so I walked down the hall and pushed open the door, and there he lay sleeping, silent, alone, curled up on the floor in his one-bedroom home. His face so gentle, his room in such disorder, not how I pictured a United States soldier. Was this the hero of whom I'd just read? Curled up in his poncho, a floor for his bed? His head was clean-shaven, his weathered face tan. I soon understood this was more than a man, for I realized the families that I saw that night owed their lives to these men who were willing to fight. Soon round the world the children would play, and grown-ups would celebrate on a bright Christmas day. They all enjoyed freedom each month of the year because of soldiers like this one lying here. I couldn't help wonder how many lay alone on a cold Christmas Eve in a land far from home. Just the very thought brought a tear to my eye. I dropped to my knees and started to cry. The soldier awakened, and I heard a rough voice. Santa, don't cry. This life is my choice. I fight for freedom. I don't ask for more. My life is my God, my country, my core. With that, he rolled over and drifted off into sleep. I couldn't control it. I continued to weep. I watched him for hours, so silent and still, I noticed he shivered from the cold night's chill. So I took off my jacket, the one made of red, and I covered this soldier from his toes to his head.
Made of red? Sorry, I just
Yes, yeah. He makes this shit out. It's magic, Josh. It's Santa Claus.
Okay.
He made my coat out of red. And I put on his t-shirt of gray and black with an eagle and an army patch embroidered on back.
But he's in the Marine Corps. He's in his Corps. Only Marines say that.
And although it barely fit me, I began to swell with pride, and for a shining moment, I was United States Army deep inside. That's what that alien pussy got too. I didn't want to leave him on that cold, dark night, this guardian of honor so willing to fight, and this is the last stanza, I promise. Then the soldier rolled over, whispered with a voice so clean and pure, "Carry on, Santa. It's Christmas Day. All is secure." One look at my watch, and I knew he was right. Merry Christmas, my friend, and to all a good night.
Aww.
And this frail, like 80-pound old lady was reading this. And everyone around was, breathing heavily and saying, wow, that really
says a lot about society.
really makes sense.
I know that this isn't even like the biggest thing to focus on, but why was sand still in his shoes? Why didn't he just take it out back and knock all the sand out? What?
I was thinking about, I was like, yeah, it's like you actually sit that guy down and you discover that the most memorable event from his deployment was someone dared him to drink an entire bottle of soy sauce and then go jack off in a porta shitter. Like,
And Jesus is watching.
Exactly.
And it's
Jesus
so-
was
it's-
watching.
The angle of it too, where he's like, "Don't cry, Santa Claus. No one needs to care about me. I'm doing this on my own and I feel great about it and nothing is going to happen to me." Like, so much of this like worship of the troops and of the army has to be like so abstract
Yeah.
because like you can't also give people the responsibility of picking up the mess.
Well, and I think the thing that gets me about it too is that it's always like this kind of idealized version of things where suffering and misery is implicit, but everyone's really joyful about it because it's their duty. And it's like I feel like no matter one of the reasons why the position on what a hell of a way to die is to not join the military, and if you're in the military you should definitely get out, is just that I think that the longer that you are in, the harder it is to deinstitutionalize yourself. The expression that we use on the show sometimes is we tell people to debathify their own brains.
Sure.
And it's harder to do that. But I feel like if this was the world, if you grew up in and I'm not trying to take or mean any offense here, but the kind of like guilelessness of that sort of worldview, you would be so unprepared for how cruel and arbitrary and how pointless everything is going to seem.
Right.
And I feel like, it's just so wild. There was something else I wanted to say, and it'll probably come back to me, but I'm interested in you guys' reactions, those of you who haven't spoken about this, like, because this is so weird.
First of all, I would say certainly no offense taken on the guilelessness point. That's one of the things that I really sort of think about now that I'm a good distance removed from this worldview is exactly that. It's like it's incredible how it is a worldview that you can only really subscribe to if you haven't experienced anything real, I guess. Like the real world so quickly disabuses you of having this much of an idealistic perspective about the world and how it works. One thing that I found that I'll have to like see if I can send you the YouTube clip for this later, Nate, and maybe you can stitch it in if you feel like it. But I found this bizarre children's musical that is intended for performance in churches called AmeriKids.
Oh my God.
And I'm just going to read you the description here. Join the annual AmeriKids convention in progress as delegates Yacky Doodle, convention chairman, Miss Dorian, historian, Pip Squeak from Rhode Island, and others learn about the faith that made our country great. Hear seldom heard words from such historical figures as Benjamin Franklin, Robert E. Lee, Abraham Lincoln, and George Washington.
Nate, if the first question that comes to mind is, does Yacky Doodle rap? Fuck. The answer is yes.
He does rap. He does rap.
Many times.
Oh my God.
Featuring the famous words of American veteran Timothy McVeigh.
But so and then in terms of how this all unfolds, like it is sort of like there's like a play within a play kind of situation, and they're like having this convention, which is the official AmeriKids convention, and we learn not only that America like the country that was designed by God Himself, in that we have the ultimate blessing of living here. We also there's actually an entire armed forces medley in there. Where they do the all the different Air Force, the fucking anchors away, anchors away, and army goes rolling along, all that shit. Which is immediately followed by a number called "Bought with a Price," which is about how freedom isn't free.
Oh shit! Fuck.
It's cool as hell. I'll send along to you a recording that I saw of it, because this was my church never got quite on this level. But there definitely is a significant chunk of the evangelical religious right that sees the United States military as a natural extension of the kingdom of God. Again, it comes back to that dominionism, right? And that is also why what Brian was saying earlier too, like the fact that George W. Bush believed that a lot of this stuff was literally true, right?
Yeah.
Like he thought that this is maybe going to usher in the apocalypse. I don't know if he believed that like reconstructing the Temple of Solomon also means that like 144,000 Jews and nobody else will be saved. But like, it's
That'd be a great turn if George W. Bush ends up being a Jehovah's Witness.
It'd be cool as hell.
So I want to leave you guys, or as we close out, and tell you something that to me is kind of indicative of that world colliding of the sort of Christian view of the world versus and of the military versus the experience of a lot of people, most people, the overwhelming majority of people who are in. And I don't know how much you guys are up on troop shit in terms of like if I use the expression telling someone to pull security, what that means, because like maybe you can conceive of it generally, but what we typically mean by that is when you're doing patrolling, when you're doing dismounted infantry stuff, or in anything with vehicles even too, the idea is that in all 360 degrees around you, around your formation, your squad, your platoon, your team, your whatever, you should have someone watching some sector of it so that every single person is watching some sector of it who's not doing a job like inside the center, so that you can't be surprised, that you aren't surprised by people rolling up on you or stuff happening or, so on those lines. And so this starts to factor in because especially in Ranger School, which is like, it's not like an elite school at all. It's just basic infantry stuff, but they make you do literally everything you're supposed to do in the manual, which makes it insanely strict. And they also, you are operating on like zero sleep and very little food. So it's miserable. But like one of the things you learn is anytime you come to a halt, anytime you're not moving, everyone basically pushes off the sort of axis of the we're moving forward, and they all kind of hide behind trees and look out and cover like a sector, and they pull security. It's like if you're not being told to do something, or you're not in leadership in the in that training rotation, you're pulling security. And then you tell people like fucking pull security, like pull, and you do that in real life too. I mean, quite frankly, you do it, but in the school, it's just drilled into you. And so I bring this up because there's this illustration that I saw shared around that's very, very funny. That's like one of those very in-depth pencil drawings, like very detailed, realistic pencil drawings. And it's got a soldier taking a knee with a rucksack, looking like really worn down, holding his rifle. And it's like a contemporary soldier. Like it's not like Vietnam or World War II. It looks like a soldier that would be in Iraq, wearing like, has like the mount on his helmet for night vision. He's carrying an M4. And he's got like the modern shaped helmet and the rucksack. And he's taking a knee, and he's like kind of looking at the ground. And basically the artist has drawn Jesus putting his hand on his shoulder.
Sweet.
And I have seen there's sort of a modification of this that got shared around, probably more so than the original art, which was just for, evangelicals, where the soldier says, "Shut up, Jesus, and pull fucking security." And that to me like just stuck in my mind when you were reading that poem. I was just like, God, when these worlds collide, it's so weird. Ugh.
It's amazing because I think that picture is on the page that I found this poem too, but they don't have Jesus there. They have that same guy kneeling, but in front of a big Christmas tree that is in the middle of a forest, but somehow has Christmas lights all over it.
Yep. Always kneeling, always suffering. Yeah. It's wild,
shut up, Santa, and pull fucking security.
Yeah, exactly. Fuck's sake. Yeah. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for making time on a Sunday, on the Lord's Day, to come on to What a Hell of a Way to Die. I want to give you all a chance to plug your show.
Yeah, so we're the worst of all possible worlds. It's bi-weekly case studies of pop culture of a dying empire. We talk a lot about Adventures in Odyssey, but also about video games and sometimes TV shows and movies. Anything that could be, construed as a pop culture item in a dying empire. I'm not good at selling things. Josh, you want to jump in here?
No, that was good. That was good. I was just going to throw in that they also have a Patreon. So if this is interesting to you and you want more, you should sign up. And I will link to both the free feed and the Patreon in the show notes to this episode, so you can listen for that.
Yeah, and we are always interested in hearing about what pieces of pop culture are interesting to our listeners or prove to be a particularly interesting example of something that's going on. Some of our best episodes have been ones where we took a look at something that we didn't really know all that much about, but we were able to find out a lot about the world and maybe ourselves even. Maybe maybe the real friends, maybe the real Maybe the real worst of all possible worlds was the friends we made along. I don't know.
Josh, pull up. We're going into the sea. Pull up. Nate, you have to come on and talk about that Mormon musical. I mean, that's just that sounds
I'll see if I
wonderful.
can find it. Yeah, it's called Saturday's Warriors. I know about it, and it's deep Mormon lore, but I just happen to be exposed. I have this affliction and also maybe an ability, which is that like I've got a pretty good memory for weird details of things, and this would have been around the age of 9 or 10 that I encountered this stuff, but like I do recall it very, very clearly. And like it's just one of those things where I've never encountered it again, but I know it's out there, and I know if I mention Saturday's Warriors on the timeline, for example, that people who grew up, observant Mormons are going to know about it. And it's just, I got this weird perspective. And I guess I don't even want to talk about it like I'm denigrating it, because most Mormons that I've met are really nice people, but like, God, there is some weird Mormon kitsch. That's the best way I can describe it. And I feel like Adventures in Odyssey is also evangelical kitsch, but it's so much more sinister.
Yeah.
Yes,
that's
absolutely.
100% the way that I feel about it. So, gentlemen, it's an absolute pleasure once again. I'm excited to come on the show. I should be on, next month, I think? In March, we were talking about it. So that's the plan. But until then, thank you so much for making time for this. And for all of you out there listening, we also have a Patreon, which you probably know about. $5 a month gets you all the bonus content, dating all the way back to 2016. It's a lot of extra episodes. So there will be
so much content.
God, it's crazy amounts of content. Yeah, I mean, and we do actually pretty much put out one bonus episode a week. So there's a ton of content. I know you live for that. Look for that link in the show notes as well. And we will speak to you soon.